This story's been told so many times it's almost not even worth repeating. Except I guess I have to fill in a few holes here and there.
After the success of characters like the Fantastic Four, the Mighty Thor, and the Incredible Hulk, Stan Lee conceived a hero who could climb on walls after spotting a spider doing that very act. Lee's publisher Martin Goodman shot down the idea, citing that people don't like spiders, not to mention that Lee wanted the character to be a teenager, wherein teenagers were usually depicted as being sidekicks at the time, and not even a popular teenager at that, just a really gangly dork, not a good-looking jock. The idea stuck with Lee, however, and Goodman would eventually relent, allowing Lee to use the final issue of low-selling anthology series Amazing Fantasy to tell a story. Lee would immediately enlist longtime collaborator Jack Kirby to work on this new Spider-Man character, only for Kirby to not exactly grasp the concept and draw another good-looking jock instead of the awkward Poindexter Lee wanted. Instead, Lee would turn to artist Steve Ditko, who drew a more spindly Peter Parker, though Kirby's Spidey would wind up gracing the cover of Amazing Fantasy.
Now, the story isn't exactly that cut and dry. For example, Jack Kirby had created similar themed characters, the Silver Spider and the Fly, for Crestwood and Archie Comics respectively, but pretty much the rest is history. Spider-Man would go on to become the flagship carrier of Marvel Comics, a mantle he still holds to pretty much this very day. And today we're looking at his debut in Amazing Fantasy and then the first 10 issues of his ongoing series. This is The Amazing Spider-Man Masterworks, Volume 1.
At Midvale High in Queens, New York, a group of teenagers is planning some fun activities.
Who wants to go drink expired apple juice and then kiss each other?
That is, of course, except for nerdlinger Peter Parker, who just has a simple response to disappoint his fellow schoolmates.
No. Bibbidi-bop kazow. I can't be pressured. No way, no how.
Instead, Peter elects to take in a demonstration of an atomic cyclotron at the local college. As the fertility of all the onlookers is thrown into jeopardy, a small spider falls into the path of the radioactive beam. The irradiated arachnid then goes flying across the room and lands on Peter Parker's hand, biting him almost instantly.
The spider would then wind up finding its way over to a South Korean exchange student named Cindy Moon, biting her as well. This in turn would lead to some very awkward moments in the future, but that's another story for another time.
Peter begins feeling an intense dizziness as he rushes outside of the lab and into the streets, where he then feels a sharp twinge in the back of his neck, causing him to leap out of the way of an oncoming vehicle. The next thing Peter knows, he's literally climbing up the walls of the side of a building. Not only does Peter now seem to have the ability of a spider to adhere to any surface, but he also seems to have gained the spider's proportionate strength. In other words, he can lift more than his own body weight if needed. As he comes to his senses over the incident and starts heading home, Peter sees an ad for a carny wrestler willing to pay $100 to an opponent who can last for at least 3 minutes. Not wishing to get found out by his Uncle Ben and Aunt May, Peter jury-rigs a costume and heads back to the carnival. Using his newfound abilities, he's able to last the 3 minutes and thus defeat Crusher Hogan, which also allows Peter to catch the eye of a talent scout who wants to book him for Toast of the Town. That being said, Peter's going to need a better outfit. So Peter heads home to begin working on a new outfit, complete with special bracelets that can dispense a substance similar to a spider's web. Dubbing himself Spider-Man, one word, no hyphen, Peter soon becomes the talk of TV. The only detractor is a local news magnate by the name of J. Jonah Jameson. That being said, the success begins going to Peter's head as he lets a burglar get away despite the pleas of a security guard. That all changes a few weeks later when Peter returns home to some terrible news. His Uncle Ben had been returning home from a walk and surprised an intruder who then shot and killed him. An irate Peter overhears that the killer has been tracked down to a nearby warehouse district, so he dons his Spider-Man outfit and goes off to find the killer.
So what exactly happened and why? Well, the burglar, whose name has never been fully revealed, though it's hinted his last name was Carradine, had found out that a mobster apparently buried a large stash of money in the Parker's backyard. This was before May and Ben had moved into the house. Now, that night, Ben and May had gotten into some type of heated argument, and Ben took a walk to cool off while May went over to her neighbor Anna Watson's home. Uncle Ben came home, startled the burglar, he was shot and killed. Peter found out about it and left to go face the criminal. However, at that point, Anna's niece, Mary Jane Watson, just happened to be looking out her bedroom window and noticed Peter crawling out in a Spider-Man outfit. As for that buried stash of cash, well, it turns out the Parkers actually had found it, and it had been completely devoured by silverfish.
Peter manages to track down the burglar and confronts him by webbing up his gun and then dropping him with a thunderous bolo punch. It's then that Peter realizes that this is the thief he let slide weeks earlier. Knowing that his inaction led to his beloved uncle's death has caused Peter to realize,
all together now.
With great powers also comes great responsibility. Unfortunately, part of that responsibility means giving up the performing arts and pursuing crime fighting instead. Soon the Parkers' finances are spent and they're starting to be late on rent. Peter offers to drop out and get a job, but May will not hear of it. Added to that, J. Jonah Jameson's constant negative comments are beginning to turn the public against Spider-Man. It's then that Peter hits on the idea of just joining the Fantastic Four and earning a living with them. He manages to sneak into the Baxter building via a service elevator and shows off some very impressive abilities and knowledge to the team. Sadly, the Fantastic Four are a non-profit group with their only real income coming from the numerous inventions that Reed has patented. So, in other words, no income for Spidey. Peter storms off, leaving behind Reed Richards, who wish they could just talk things out. Maybe he could have offered this kid a paid internship or something. Elsewhere, a Soviet spy who goes by the codename the Chameleon sets about stealing some nuclear secrets. He manages to witness a report about Spider-Man, which gives the Master of Disguise an idea. He begins designing his own spider suit and uses that to stage a robbery at a military base over some bomb plans. The Chameleon then uses a special sonic frequency to trigger Peter Parker's spider sense, which brings him to the military base, causing the guards to turn their guns on him.
Dmitry Smerdyakov is the Chameleon, a master of disguise who utilizes various Hollywood effects at this point to alter his appearance and pass himself off as other people. Now later he would gain a belt buckle that would have an hallucinogenic gas that allowed him to alter his appearance. And then eventually he would just get surgery that genetically augmented his ability and just gave him mutagenic skin.
Spidey sees the Chameleon fleeing in a chopper and uses his webs as slingshots to fly up and bring down the whirlybird. However, the Chameleon managed to stage another escape attempt by disguising himself as a police officer and then causing a power outage in the building. However, he manages to trigger Peter's spider sense so he can detect the Chameleon and fight him in the dark, eventually tackling him and revealing his fake Spider-Man suit. Unfortunately, while Spider-Man seems to have cleared his name, it doesn't exactly lead to great press, though the Fantastic Four continue to think very highly of him. Peter finally decides to start using the press to an advantage when he overhears the others at school talking about an offer from J. Jonah Jameson for pictures of a new villain called the Vulture. This criminal uses a special winged harness powered by magnetics to literally fly through the air to stage his robberies. Peter goes home and modifies an old instant camera to attach to the belt of his costume and adds some additional storage for his canisters of web fluid. He lucks out as the Vulture is busy taunting the authorities about his next heist. Unfortunately, the camera makes a little too much noise and Spider-Man's presence is alerted to the villain. The Vulture is actually able to loop back and attack Spider-Man from behind, rendering him unconscious and then dropping him off in a nearby water tower. Thankfully, after escaping the water tower, Peter discovers that his camera wasn't damaged so he can develop the pictures and take them over to J. Jonah Jameson and sell them under the condition that the publisher never question his methods and only credit him as a staff photographer.
Now, contrary to what you may think, Peter did not sell his pictures to the Daily Bugle newspaper. Rather, he sold to its sister company, which is also run by J. Jonah Jameson, a high society magazine called Now Magazine.
As he starts heading home, Peter notices a group of people, including his classmates Flash Thompson and Liz Allen, gathering outside where the Vulture claims his next heist is going to be. All the onlookers are focused on the skies and not the sewers, which is where the winged baddie pops up to steal a cache of diamonds. Peter slips into a nearby alley undetected and manages to change into Spider-Man to go after the Vulture. That being said, Peter was actually able to deduce the magnetic polarities that the Vulture uses to achieve flight and thus invent a little inverter that will reverse the polarity of the neutron flow. The device manages to work, causing the Vulture to softly spiral down to the streets below, where he is soon arrested. Which is good, because Jameson's pay is more than enough to cover a full year's worth of rent for the Parkers, with some spare change to pay for a new kitchen. Things even begin looking up for Peter at school as a highly respected electronics scientist named Cobwell takes him on as a weekend intern. First things first, Peter needs to pick up Professor Cobwell's radio from a repair shop run by someone who calls himself. However, shortly after returning with the device, Peter's spider sense begins going off. On his break, Peter inspects the radio and finds a lot of listening equipment inside the circuitry, and it's not for picking up the score of the Mets game. He heads back to the repair shop to find the Tinkerer working with what appears to be a group of alien communists to learn all of the national security secrets so they can stage an invasion of Earth. Spider-Man tries taking on the group, but winds up getting trapped inside a containment chamber. That being said, he's actually able to take advantage of the situation by utilizing an air hole that's just small enough for him to get a shot of webbing through it to hit the release switch. A fire breaks out during the ensuing fight, and the shop winds up burning down, with the Tinkerer and his goons heading back to their spaceship so they can leave Earth for their home planet of, Earth.
Yeah, the Tinkerer and his group, they are not actually aliens. They're just guys in suits. In fact, the Tinkerer doesn't appear for like another 10 to 15 years after this, so yeah. He's not exactly a glowing spot in Spider-Man's huge rogues gallery. Our next villain, on the other hand...
At a government nuclear research lab, Dr. Otto Octavius conducts experiments using specifically constructed arms that grant him the ability to work with the dangerous chemicals from a safe distance. This has in turn bestowed upon him the nickname of Dr. Octopus. Suddenly, a power surge on the other end of the building goes off and causes an explosion, throwing the good doctor across the room. A highly radioactive Octavius winds up getting rushed to the local hospital. 5 days later, Octavius awakens and demands to be allowed to return to work, believing he's being held back by his jealous coworkers. It's then that the additional arms begin to come to life and operate on their own to break the now newly rechristened Dr. Octopus out.
Technically, Dr. Octopus and his arms are only telepathically bonded. He can actually remove them at any time. They're not telepathically and physically bonded like you see in most movie and TV shows. In fact, Octavius has actually upgraded the arms on several occasions in recent years.
At the Daily Bugle, J. Jonah Jameson demands pictures of Octavius, unaware of the attempted escape, and eventually gives the opportunity to Peter Parker when his staff photographers fail. Peter arrives at the local medical facility as Spider-Man, and he finds Dr. Octopus holding the staff hostage in order to continue his research. Spidey tries to fight the good doctor, but the additional appendages won't allow for any type of close-quarters combat, and eventually Spider-Man just is thrown out of a window with no pictures being taken. Meanwhile, Dr. Octopus heads back to the proper research facility and the lab in order to see if he can use his testing for more nefarious means. As this plays out, Peter attends a school assembly with a special guest.
So, you got detention.
Actually, it's the Human Torch giving a motivational speech, which actually does seem to affect Peter, inspiring him to go back and properly take the pictures of Dr. Octopus. He obviously dons his Spider-Man costume once more and begins navigating Octopus's security measures to find an empty room in the chem lab. In the lab, Spider-Man is able to whip up a corrosive to try to use on Octopus's arms. Unfortunately, the Doctor attacks, and only one of the arms winds up being slightly damaged. That being said, the fight still manages to turn in Spider-Man's favor once he manages to blast a web shot in the Doctor's face, and manages to then drop him with a thunderous bolo punch.
He forgot to take those pictures again, didn't he?
Spider-Man winds up being back on a no-luck streak, this time being typified by going after a group of criminals before they committed such a crime, thus they have plausible deniability. It's then that he spots someone actually committing a crime by breaking into a bank, only for the individual to suddenly and quite literally slip through Spider-Man's fingers. It turns out that this is the Sandman who's been dominating headlines across the country, and he drops Peter with a thunderous bolo punch so bad that it winds up splitting his mask, causing Spidey to have to hightail it back to Queens.
William Baker, alias Flint Marko, is an escaped convict who sought refuge from the authorities on an island outside of Savannah, Georgia, that had been used for nuclear testing. Baker bonded with the molecular sand, which gave him the sand's properties. He can either become dust, or he can become solid as rock.
A dejected Peter feigns sickness to throw Aunt May off while he stitches his mask back together. The next day, he pays a visit to the Daily Bugle and Jameson about a possible advance, but no pics, no pay. Peter then goes back to school where, during class, the Sandman slips in to try to use it as a hideout. The Sandman winds up taking the class hostage as Peter was out cleaning some test tubes, which is fortunate as it gives Peter enough time to change into a Spider-Man costume, come back, confront the Sandman, and impress his classmates in the process. The two fight each other throughout the school, with Spidey ultimately leading the Sandman into a supply basement where he can then trap him inside a shop vac. He then uses some flame-retardant sand to stage some photos. The fact that Spider-Man saved a school rankles Jameson, but he's happy to get the pictures of the fight. It's not all victory for Peter, though, as Flash Thompson and the others continue bullying him for missing the fight. The The fact of the matter is, the constant bullying from both his classmates and J. Jonah Jameson is slowly starting to get to Peter. However, it does seem that a lifeline is going to be thrown to him when none other than Dr. Doom uses a communication technique similar to what the Chameleon did a few issues back. Doom wishes to work with Spider-Man in order to take down the FF and eventually the world.
Of course!
Spider-Man responds by trapping Dr. Doom in a web, only for it to turn out to be a Doombot. The two begin tussling, and eventually Doom just blasts Spider-Man through a window and into the nearby river. Doom manages to take no precautions and blows up the facility shortly after leaving. Peter did manage to snap a few pictures, but he does have to wind up dealing with more ranting from Jameson. Meanwhile, Flash Thompson dons some Spider-Man cosplay in an attempt to set up Peter Parker for a prank. Funny thing though, this is just as Dr. Doom is attempting to use some global positioning systems to track the radioactive signature of Spider-Man. A drone sent into the Forest Hill section of Queens winds up spotting Peter Parker and Flash dressed as Spider-Man, so naturally the good doctor winds up kidnapping Flash and knocking him unconscious. Dr. Doom then hijacks a TV signal to make his ultimatum to the Fantastic Four: disband or the Wallcrawler gets it. Obviously, Peter Parker is just a tiny bit confused until Liz Allen calls him to explain that Flash has been missing since the prank. Putting two and two together, Peter must set out to rescue his tormentor. Using his spider sense to hone in on Dr. Doom's new headquarters, Spider-Man sneaks in through an air vent to surprise Doom. He manages to battle Doom enough to a standstill only to get jumped by another Doombot. However, before the Doctor can deliver the killing blow, the Fantastic Four arrive in the Fantastic Car, and Doom decides to hightail it out, knowing that he's not strong enough to deal with 5 heroes at once. Spider-Man is also forced to leave the facility as the Thing winds up rescuing Flash Thompson.
Of course, still being Peter Parker means that he has to wind up on the short end of the stick again, as now Flash Thompson has a really cool story about meeting the Fantastic Four, making him more popular than ever.
There's no rest for the worry, though, as reports soon begin coming in from Florida about the locals being attacked by a large humanoid lizard. The Bugle posits for Spider-Man to actually take on this creature, mainly because Jameson doesn't think it'll actually happen. Peter Parker, on the other hand, thinks there might be a possibility and wants a paid trip to the Sunshine State to cover for it. After some convincing from Spider-Man himself, Jameson relents, but only if he'll accompany Peter to ensure accuracy.
No doubt breaking several laws, as Peter Parker is still technically 15 years old here. Yeah, and one of the odd aspects of these early Spider-Man stories is the fact that Peter Parker actually aged in real time. By 1962 he was in high school, and in 1966 he was in college. In fact, it's one of the rare mistakes Stan Lee ever really admitted to making. Just the idea that, well, that character is so popular with teenagers, he probably should have kept him in high school a lot longer.
As he and Jameson head to Florida, Peter reads up on the area's foremost herpetologist, Dr. Kurt Connors. Wondering if Connors would be able to explain this lizard-human creature, Spider-Man goes looking for him. Spidey ends up running into the lizard, who literally just tosses him around and eventually up into a tree. Spider-Man then spots Dr. Connors' lab. He heads over to the facility to find Kurt's wife, Martha Connors, in tears. She explains what happened.
Kurt Connors was wounded in the Korean War and lost his arm in the process. Afterwards, he began studying lizards based on their ability to regrow limbs, hoping to develop some type of serum that allowed him to do the same for his arm. He developed said serum and tested it upon himself, which did regrow his arm. However, over time, he began to gain a more reptilian appearance, and including a lizard brain. And no, I don't mean he suddenly got incredibly sexist.
The story is interrupted by the couple's son, Billy, crying out as it appears the lizard is trying to trap him with a water moccasin. Spider-Man manages to rescue the kid and returns to the lab, hoping to develop an anti-serum to restore Dr. Connors. He's interrupted by the returning of the lizard, who just wants to steal his original serum in order to make more creatures like him. He smashes up the lab, so now Peter is only left with one copy of the anti-serum, so it really needs to count. Once more, Spider-Man uses his spider sense to track down the lizard and set up a confrontation at an abandoned Spanish fort. The two wind up fighting into a tower room where Spider-Man uses the verticality to pour the anti-serum down the lizard's throat. Dr. Connors is restored, though once more his arm is missing, and Spider-Man swears to keep everything a secret. To that end, Peter Parker bumps into J. Jonah Jameson and says that he discovered that the lizard is basically just a tourist trap that certain individuals used fake photos to lure people in with. It works, and the two head home to New York City, with Jameson explaining that this expense is being taken out of Peter's paycheck.
And now, the return of the Vulture.
For some strange reason, the state penitentiary allows the Vulture access to the machine shop where he begins ferreting equipment to make a set of cheap wings for an escape. When news of the escape reaches Peter Parker, he feigns sickness to get out of a volleyball match and goes to investigate, making sure to grab his magnetic inverter for another confrontation. Spider-Man does manage to spot the Vulture using a new wing harness and proceeds to activate his magnetic inverter. It seems to work as the Vulture appears to fall once more, only to immediately double back and land a massive uppercut on the wall crawler. It turns out that the Vulture's new wing harness includes a gyroscope with a rotating polarity, meaning that it can't be inverted. He then knocks Spider-Man off a roof at an angle that the wall crawler can't seem to shoot out any webbing in order to latch onto anything. Peter does manage to rotate to break his fall, but winds up badly spraining his shoulder in the process. He covers it with Aunt May, saying that he hurt his shoulder playing volleyball in the schoolyard, which in turn earns him even more mockery from his classmates as he barely played any volleyball. Peter did manage to take some pictures of the fight, only for the Bugle to turn him down, as it turns out there's just too many pictures of the Vulture out there, so there's no more money in it. It's then that the Vulture attacks once more, this time at the Bugle as he's intent on stealing the payroll. Peter manages to slip out and change into a Spider-Man costume, fashioning one of his web wings to act as a sling for his injured shoulder.
Yes, the original Spider-Man outfit had webbing between the arm and torso, giving the impression that he had wings. Now, over time, they just kind of disappeared, probably because artists felt that they were just a little too clunky and time-consuming to draw. Now, they have also popped up on a few occasions as well, only to then just as quickly disappear, never to be mentioned again.
The Vulture and Spider-Man fight throughout the Bugle office, causing Secretary Betty Brant to duck behind her desk. Eventually, the two fight all the way to the printing press room, where the Vulture suddenly lures Spider-Man outside and grabs him to take off. With one desperate shot, Spider-Man manages to web up the Vulture's wings, causing the two to begin falling, with only a web parachute slowing them down. Spidey then hangs the Vulture out before webbing up Jameson's mouth to shut him up for a few hours. This in turn will give Peter Parker the time to begin bonding and flirting with Betty Brant.
No, the idea of Peter and Betty Brant having a romance is not as illicit as you'd think. She's only about 17 years old, having dropped out of school at the age of 16 to replace her mother as J. Jonah Jameson's secretary, for reasons we'll get into in Volume 2 of the Amazing Spider-Man Masterworks.
Back at the school, Peter and Flash Thompson get into it once again just before a demonstration, and this fight actually results in Peter's glasses getting smashed. It's okay though, as it turns out he really doesn't seem to need them anymore. It's then that a large mechanoid is wheeled into the classroom. It turns out this is a highly advanced artificial intelligence, capable of ripping off an artist and passing off the work as its own 3 times better than any other computer could in the 1960s. Peter, being the best student in the class, is allowed to input a question into this new living brain, while the machine's 2 handlers plot to steal it in order to use it to bet on horse racing.
Still probably a better investment than crypto.
At the behest of his classmates, Peter must ask the machine to calculate Spider-Man's identity. Several factors about his height, weight, and where Spider-Man's most frequently spotted are input into the machine as Peter begins to fill with dread. Thankfully, the answer is in a binary code that needs to be translated over 24 hours. However, that just doesn't seem to be enough for Flash Thompson, who tries to rip the code out of Peter's hands. This in turn leads to yet another scuffle, with finally the teachers getting involved, saying that the two want to settle this. They should do it in the boxing ring in the gym. The 2 teenagers suit up and prepare to throw down, as the onlookers can't help but notice that Peter Parker suddenly got kind of ripped.
Yes, Peter's body is gradually going through a lot of changes here, and I don't just mean puberty. He obviously has, again, improved his eyesight to the point he doesn't need his glasses anymore. And yeah, he's basically getting a free workout every night when he goes out and fights crime, so now he's starting to get a little muscular and buff. I mean, earlier in the comic, there was a point where someone grabbed his arm and noticed that it was incredibly ropey, which it hadn't been for a long time. So yeah, again, he's changing a little bit here. It's actually kind of nice to see, rather than say in the movies where he just automatically gets ripped for no apparent reason.
I'm fine.
Everything being as it is, Peter still has to hold back in order to avoid severely hurting Flash. However, that's easier said than done, as one thunderous bolo punch sends Flash tumbling out of the ring. While P tries playing rope-a-dope a decade early, the 2 movers attempt to steal the living brain. They get caught, and in the ensuing scuffle, the machine begins short-circuiting and rampaging throughout the school. The ruckus, caused by all the other students trying to clear out of the school, distracts Flash just as Peter is throwing another punch. Flash gets knocked out, however Peter doesn't exactly win the fight, as it looks like he took a cheap shot. The emergency call to evacuate the school allows Peter to get Flash to safety in the locker room and change into Spider-Man. He then sets about trying to tackle this living brain, with the only problem being...
Can't be bargained with. It can't be reasoned with?
Spider-Man does manage to lead the living brain towards a staircase where he can web swing it through a window. This slows everything down enough for Spider-Man to deactivate the living brain. Meanwhile, Flash regains consciousness and inadvertently trips up the failed thieves who are trying to escape just as Flash is tying his shoes. This allows Peter to throw the question of Spider-Man's identity off by pointing out that Flash disappeared when the wall crawlers showed up.
This is followed by a rather bizarre little backup story where Spider-Man wrecks a party being thrown by the Human Torch because he gets all the women, apparently? I'm not entirely sure. All I know is Spidey and the Torch get into a fight, and then he gets into a fight with the old Fantastic Four overall, until Sue Storm flirts with him, and then everything's okay. Really, the only noteworthy point of this is one of the rare times Jack Kirby actually gets to draw Spider-Man, and you can see why Ditko is probably the preferred artist here, as Kirby's Spidey looks a lot like a linebacker.
Peter rushes through the streets of Spider-Man in order to get home to Aunt May, who's become deathly ill. The prescribed medicine he picked up gets administered, but it isn't very effective, and the doctor says she's going to eventually need surgery, so it's off to the hospital. The thought of losing both Aunt May and Uncle Ben in the span of a year really digs deep into Peter and puts him in a funk so bad that not even Flash's taunting gets noticed. On the bright side, Peter does get a visit from Betty Brant at the hospital. That being said, this is not going to be cheap, so Peter is going to need to sell some Spider-Man photos. Unfortunately, New York City has been hit with several thunderstorms, which just washes those plans right out. One of those storms resulted in lightning striking a utility worker named Maxwell Dillon. Instead of killing him, however, Dillon gains the ability to charge and channel electricity through his body like a living battery. Calling himself Electro, Dillon goes on a crime spree that includes money from J. Jonah Jameson's personal account. That being said, Jameson thinks Electro is just a new moniker for Spider-Man. Peter overhears that Jameson is willing to pay top dollar for pictures that prove Electro is Spider-Man, and it would be more than enough to cover May's surgery. So he sets out to catch a picture of this new villain, weather permitting. Unfortunately, Spidey's clothing actually acts as a conductor, and Dillon is able to shock the wall crawler into unconsciousness with just one touch. Still, Peter gets his photos and is able to pay for May's surgery. However, he's torn as news soon breaks out of Electro causing a prison riot in order to start his own gang. But Peter has to wait for May to be out of her surgery. Thankfully, she pulls through, but Betty warns Peter to stay away from the prison, citing an aspect of her past. That being said, he knows what needs to be done and leaves to confront Electro. This time, though, Spidey has some rubber gloves and booties on his feet in order to nullify any electricity. He then uses the emergency fire hose to douse Electro, causing him to short circuit and knock himself out. Peter once more has more pictures, but it seems to have lost his chance with Betty. And now it seems that the criminal underworld is really starting to take notice of Spider-Man, including someone who calls himself the Big Man. The Big Man attempts to unite all the crime families, becoming some type of kingpin of crime, but they need some convincing, so he calls upon his personal enforcers.
The enforcers consist of a martial arts master named Fancy Dan Brito, a rodeo lariat specialist by the name of Jackson Bryce, who uses the codename Montana, and Robert Block, aka Ox. His powers are pretty self-explanatory.
The enforcers make quick work of the other family's goons and proceed to leave crime sprees all over New York City that are directed by Big Man. Meanwhile, Flash and Liz visit May in the hospital when Peter is approached about needing blood for a transfusion. Afraid that his spider properties could affect May, he needs to be goaded into it by Flash and Liz. Thankfully, all the tests come back negative, meaning that there isn't going to be a problem for at least another 23 issues. Back at the Daily Bugle, J. Jonah Jameson is positive that Big Man is really Spider-Man and also probably still Electro. He proceeds to task reporter Frederick Foswell with finding a connection between everyone. While that plays out, Betty receives a visit from the enforcers who want more money from her for some reason. Peter happens across this situation and intercedes, only to wind up getting bear-hugged by Ox. When the enforcers leave, Peter chastises Betty for getting involved with the mob, and she runs off crying.
Again, we'll deal with that in Volume 2 of the Masterworks.
Spider-Man sets out to track down Big Man and the enforcers, even going as far as to use a giant spider prop to get information from a stool pigeon. He winds up getting snagged by Montana's lasso and meets his new adversaries. The numbers game is just a little too much for Spidey, and he's forced to stage an escape via a power outage. It's then that he spots J. Jonah Jameson walking through the area and begins to think that he must really be Big Man. Peter tries to contact Betty Brant, but unfortunately she's just skipped town. Back at the Daily Bugle, Jameson is still insistent that Spider-Man and Big Man are connected, prompting Foswell to finally just ask the question everyone's been wondering this time: what exactly is the deal here?
In a nutshell, J. Jonah Jameson feels that the heroes like Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four distract from real heroes like soldiers, first responders, and, in particular, astronauts like his son John Jameson. I have yet to figure out if Jonah still holds these beliefs after his son John gets transformed into a werewolf.
Peter decides to lay a trap by letting it loudly slip that he's actually discerned the big man's identity. Of course, he still thinks it's Jameson as the enforcers bring him in for questioning. The second Peter is left alone in the room, he manages to break out as Spider-Man and confront everyone, including the big man. This time they're at a construction site, which allows Spidey to utilize the environment to his advantage. He manages to neutralize the enforcers long enough to activate his spider signal and bring the police. Unfortunately, the big man seems to get away. That being said, Peter did manage to call the police with news that he had evidence that was at the Daily Bugle that J. Jonah Jameson was the big man. The cops do arrive and investigate the premises, and they do find evidence that the big man is indeed Daily Bugle reporter Frederick Foswell. The police reveal that they found the big man outfit and voice changer inside of Foswell's storage locker at the Bugle, and Foswell actually just cops to everything. As Foswell is dragged away, the police talk to Jameson about how much Spider-Man actually helped them in this investigation, and that maybe he deserves a little bit of credit for this. And maybe Jameson should really just learn to lay off the wall crawler for a while. This can't help but make J. Jonah Jameson wonder if he's actually been wrong the entire time.
No, it's the children who are wrong. Anyway, that concludes our look at the first volume of The Amazing Spider-Man Masterworks. How was it? Well, on the plus side, I think there's some really great artwork in here. Like I said, I actually enjoy Peter Parker's slow physical progression throughout all of this. The fact that he does start out as your classic 98-pound weakling, but he is becoming more athletic, more strong. Again, he doesn't need his glasses. I think there's some great characterization in this. You know who's the good guy, you know who's the bad guys. You understand motivation still. They can still be layered, but it still overall works. I think there's some decent enough pacing in this very early on. I do think it gets a little bit better once they start doing done-in-one stories, not trying to do backup stories or two stories in an issue or chapters throughout the book. When they just do one straightforward story, it really does work very well. If I do have some gripes, that's obviously not all the villains hit. The Tinkerer and the Enforcers are pretty flat. Dr. Doom is alright just to kind of see Spider-Man go up against someone else, but it feels like it's really early to do that. And yeah, that's about it there. And, you know, for the most part, like I said, the backup stories are just kind of dull. They don't really add much. They're just kind of annoying. It's like, okay, you clearly didn't have enough for one issue, so you had to cram two stories into here. It just feels really clunky and awkward at some points. Still, though, those are pretty minor quibbles. Sometimes you have to put up with a little when you cover a lot of stuff. So, I'm going to give The Amazing Spider-Man Masterworks Volume 1 an A. And with that, let's see what we'll be doing next time on the Random Trade Review.
Hey guys, remember you can help support the channel at patreon.com/sleepytimeforcat productions. There you can request a tray to be put in the randomizer, aka the cardboard box. And as always, remember to like, comment, share, subscribe, and ring that notification bell.